They didn't steal my boat or my car or my house. No, they stole my dock. Just walked right onto my property, pointed at the thing I built with my own two hands and said, "This belongs to Brent now. Brent is her son, jobless, entitled, always on his phone. And I'm Darren, by the way. Engineer, not exactly the yelling type. But that day I almost lost it. This whole thing got so weird so fast, I still don't know how I didn't lose my mind. Ever had something taken from you like that? I mean, really taken. I'd love to hear that in the comments." I never thought I'd be the kind of guy who gets into neighborhood drama. I mean, I'm 35, I work as an engineer, and honestly, I just wanted to come home, sit on my dock, and drink my coffee in peace. For years, my mornings had a sacred rhythm. Coffee in hand, lake ahead, silence around me. That rhythm snapped the day Brent showed up. My little slice of heaven was this 20-foot wooden dock I built myself. Nothing fancy but solid as a rock and built to code. That dock wasn't just a structure to me, it was my sanctuary. I should have known that kind of peace never lasts forever, especially when new neighbors move in who think the whole world revolves around them. The trouble started about 2 months after Pamela Sloan moved into the house 3 doors down from mine. Pamela was one of those women you spot from a mile away. Blonde bob haircut that looked like she'd just stepped out of a salon, always carrying a clipboard like she was running for mayor. And she had this walkie-talkie thing she'd talk into constantly. I swear within a week of moving in, she'd somehow gotten herself elected as the new HOA president. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to how that happened so fast. But honestly, I just didn't care about neighborhood politics. I figured as long as nobody bothered me and my dock, we'd all get along fine. Boy, was I wrong about that. The first sign of trouble was her son, Brent. This kid was probably in his mid-20s, always glued to his phone, and from what I could tell, he didn't have a job. Not that I'm judging. Times are tough, and maybe he was looking for work. But there was something about the way he'd just wander around the neighborhood that made me uncomfortable. The way he stood there wasn't casual, his hands stuffed into the pockets of that oversized hoodie, head tilted, watching the dock like it might respond to him. Week 1, he'd just walk by my place and stare at the dock for a few minutes. Not hostile or anything, just curious, I guess. I didn't think much of it at the time. It wasn't that he returned, it was that he started setting up camp. First a cooler, then a chair, then that Bluetooth speaker. Not loud enough to really complain about, but loud enough that I couldn't enjoy my usual quiet time. At first I tried to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he didn't realize it was private property. Maybe his mom hadn't explained the property lines. I mean, the dock's right there on the water. From a distance, I guess it could look like community property if you didn't know better. I told myself I was being paranoid, that maybe he was just lost. But deep down, something tightened in my gut every time I saw him there. So I didn't say anything the first few times. But then week 4 hit, and the kid escalated. He started bringing snacks, a cooler, even a little folding chair. And here's the part that really got to me. He'd leave trash. Empty chip bags, soda cans, sandwich wrappers. Just leave them there for me to clean up. I'm standing there one evening picking up his garbage, thinking to myself, this can't be an accident anymore, right? He's got to know this is my property. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I walk out to my dock with my coffee ready to start my day the way I always do. And there's Brent sprawled across the wooden bench where I usually sit. He's got his feet up, he's got a beer can, at 8 in the morning, and it's sitting right on top of my old design catalog that I'd left out there the night before. I took a deep breath, walked over, and said as politely as I could manage, "Excuse me, this is private property." The kid looked up at me, shrugged, and went right back to scrolling on his phone like I hadn't said anything. I stood there for a good 10 seconds, waiting for some kind of response, some acknowledgement that he had heard me. Nothing, just the sound of him tapping on his screen. I was about to say something else, probably something I'd regret later, when I heard voices coming from Pamela's yard. I couldn't make out everything, but I caught enough to make my blood run cold. As I'm walking back toward my house trying to figure out what to do next, I hear Pamela on her phone in her backyard, and she's saying, "Just keep him out there every day. People get used to seeing things, then it becomes normal." I froze. I actually stopped walking and just stood there in the shadows between our properties, listening to every word. Once it's been going on for a few weeks, we can make it official. Nobody questions something that's already happening. I couldn't see her face, but I could hear the satisfaction in her voice, like she was already celebrating some kind of victory. Standing there in the shadows, listening to every word she said, I suddenly realized I wasn't just dealing with some inconsiderate kid who didn't understand property lines. This was planned. This was deliberate. Pamela was using her son to stake some kind of claim on my dock, and they were both in on it. The casual way Brent had dismissed me, the increasing boldness of his behavior, the timing of it all made perfect sense now. I felt this mix of anger and disbelief wash over me. I mean, who does that? Who moves into a neighborhood and immediately starts plotting to take over their neighbor's property? But then I thought about that clipboard she always carried, that walkie-talkie, the way she'd gotten herself made HOA president so quickly. This woman was a planner, and apparently I was her next target. Was this actually a plan? 3 mornings passed like static, until that envelope hit my mailbox like a thrown brick. I'm standing there in my driveway, flipping through the usual bills and junk mail, when I see this thick envelope with Homeowners Association, Urgent Community Matter, stamped across the front in red ink. I tore it open right there on the spot, and what I read made me question whether I was living in reality or some kind of bizarre alternate universe. It felt like reading a bureaucratic hallucination, like someone had taken scissors to reality and pasted their own version on top. The letter informed me that my dock was being redesignated as Community Waterfront Access, and that Brent Sloan had been assigned as the official waterfront coordinator due to special community needs. Community Waterfront Access. My dock wasn't even visible from the street. You had to walk through my backyard to get to it. And waterfront coordinator. What the hell was a waterfront coordinator supposed to do? Coordinate what exactly? The way Brent left trash everywhere and hogged the best spot for his afternoon naps. I looked at the signature line, and it was signed by something called the Emergency Community Board, and countersigned by the former board secretary. That name rang a bell, so I dug out my old HOA paperwork, and sure enough, that secretary had been on the board until she moved away 4 months ago. I actually called her old number, and her voicemail message confirmed what I already suspected. She hadn't been involved in any HOA business since March. So, not only was this whole thing completely made up, but they'd forged a signature from someone who didn't even live here anymore. I mean, how stupid did they think I was? Or maybe the better question was, how stupid did they think everyone else was? Because surely other people in the neighborhood would notice that the former board secretary hadn't been to a meeting in months. But then again, how many people actually paid attention to HOA politics? Most folks just wanted to keep their heads down and avoid any drama. Maybe Pamela was counting on that. Maybe she figured if she threw around enough official-looking paperwork, people would just assume it was legitimate. It was a calculated gamble that everyone would be too busy or too trusting to actually verify her claims. And honestly, it probably would have worked on most people who weren't engineers, trained to check every specification twice. I'd once flagged a miscalculated drainage spec on a city project that saved them $500,000. Now I was using those same instincts to fight off a HOA coup. I attacked the lie like a blueprint, review highlighting fault lines, cross-referencing every clause, marking the contradictions like cracks in a wall. Purchase agreement survey maps, original HOA bylaws, county records, everything. My engineering background kicked in, and I approached this like I would any technical problem: gather all the data, analyze it systematically, and find the flaws in their argument. And boy, were there flaws. First off, there wasn't a single clause in the HOA rules about converting private property to community use. Not even close. The community access provisions only applied to property that was already designated as common area, and my dock was built entirely on my lot. Second, the whole emergency community board thing was complete fiction. According to the bylaws, any changes to property designations had to be voted on by the full membership with 30 days notice. When I called the HOA office to ask about this mysterious emergency vote, the receptionist sounded confused. She put me on hold for about 5 minutes, then came back and said that Mrs. Sloan had approved everything through proper channels, and that there had been adequate community input. I asked her to be more specific. What vote? When did it happen? Who was present? She said she'd have Mrs. Sloan call me back to explain the details. That was on a Thursday. By Monday, I still hadn't heard from Pamela, but Brent had apparently decided that the official letter gave him carte blanche to treat my dock like his personal resort. I'm talking folding chair cooler full of beer, even a little portable table where he'd set up his phone to watch videos. The kid had essentially moved his entire afternoon routine to my property, and I was starting to feel like a hotel owner who'd never agreed to rent out rooms. The whole situation would have been almost comical if it wasn't so infuriating. Here's this grown man camped out on my property acting like he owned the place, while his mother hides behind fake paperwork and forged signatures. And the craziest part? Other neighbors were starting to treat it like it was normal. Mrs. Miller from next door walked by one afternoon and actually waved at Brent like he belonged there. The Johnsons mentioned in passing that it was nice to see the waterfront area getting some use. It was like Pamela's plan was actually working. People were getting used to seeing Brent on my dock, and pretty soon they'd start thinking that was just how things were supposed to be. I couldn't help but wonder how many other neighborhood traditions had started this way, with someone just bold enough to keep doing something until everyone else got tired of questioning it. That's when I caught my first glimpse of Greg, Pamela's husband. I'd seen him around, but never really paid attention before. Middle-aged guy, quiet, kind of kept to himself. But one evening, I'm watching from my kitchen window as Brent's making his usual mess on my dock, and I see Greg walk out to their backyard. He stops, stares at the situation for a minute, then shakes his head and walks back inside. There was something about his body language that suggested he wasn't exactly on board with his wife's schemes. I wondered if he even knew what she was up to, or if he was just as much in the dark as the rest of us. Either way, it was clear that not everyone in the Sloan household was united behind this ridiculous plan. I decided it was time to stop playing defense and start taking action. I called a property lawyer that Friday and explained the whole situation. He listened patiently while I read him the fake HOA letter, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment before saying, "Well, that's certainly creative." He agreed to send a cease and desist letter to both the HOA and Pamela, personally demanding that they stop trespassing on my property and retract their fraudulent claims. He also suggested I document everything going forward: photos, videos, dates, times, witnesses. If this goes to court, he said, we want to make sure we have a clear record of their behavior. Holding that forged letter in my hands, I realized I was playing a game where I didn't understand all the rules yet. But did they know who they were playing with? The cease and desist letter hit Pamela like a lightning bolt, and her reaction was, well, let's just say it wasn't what you'd call measured or professional. My lawyer sent it on a Tuesday, and by Wednesday morning, my phone was ringing every hour on the hour, with Pamela screaming at me about harassment, legal bullying, and attacking a family in need. At 2:13 a.m., she left one that started with legal threats and ended with her weeping about protecting the community spirit. I saved them all. The first call, I actually tried to have a reasonable conversation with her. I explained that the dock was on my property, that her letter contained forged signatures, and that if she wanted to discuss community waterfront access, there were proper channels for that. But reasoning with Pamela was like trying to negotiate with a hurricane. She'd just talk over me louder and louder until I finally hung up. And then she'd call right back. By Thursday, she'd moved beyond phone calls and launched what I can only describe as a neighborhood smear campaign. She started going door to door, telling everyone who would listen that I was selfish and anti-community. According to Pamela's version of events, I was somehow preventing access to public waterfront space and denying basic recreational opportunities to a young man who just needed a place to relax and recover. She painted Brent as some kind of victim who was being persecuted by his mean, wealthy neighbor who HOA'd lakefront access. The wealthy part was particularly ridiculous. I'm an engineer, not a tech mogul, and I bought my house because it was the smallest lakefront property available and still stretched my budget. But here's the thing about neighborhood gossip. It doesn't have to be true to be effective. Within a week, I could feel the change in how people looked at me. Mrs. Miller, who used to chat with me about her garden when I was getting my mail, suddenly found reasons to go back inside whenever she saw me coming. The Johnsons stopped waving hello when I'd drive past their house. Someone, and I have my suspicions about who, started throwing trash on my lawn every few days. Nothing dramatic, just enough to make it clear that I wasn't exactly winning any popularity contests. I kept thinking to myself, how did I become the bad guy in this situation? I'm literally just trying to use my own property. It was like being in some twisted version of high school, where the mean girl had convinced everyone that I was the problem, and the evidence didn't matter as much as the story people wanted to believe. This dock had seen my father's ashes scattered, my niece's first fishing cast. To them it was just wood. To me it was memory anchored to land. The low point came on a Saturday afternoon when I'd finally had enough of watching Brent treat my dock like his personal entertainment center. I marched out there and confronted him directly, probably more aggressively than I should have. "Get off my dock now!" I yelled loud enough that I'm sure the neighbors heard. Brent, of course, had his phone out and recorded the whole thing. He didn't argue or fight back. He just sat there with this smirk on his face while he filmed me losing my temper. And just like that, I gave them what they needed, a shaky video of a man at his limit. Not a villain, not a hero, just a guy trying not to snap. Within hours, I'm sure that video made its way to Pamela as evidence of my hostile and threatening behavior toward a vulnerable young man. I felt like the bad guy in my own neighborhood. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I should have just let the kid use the dock and worked out some kind of sharing arrangement, but then I'd look at my dock that I built with my own hands, and see this stranger treating it like his personal hangout spot, and the anger would come flooding back. I wasn't sure if I was being reasonable or just stubborn, but I knew that giving in now would send the message that anyone could just claim my property if they were persistent enough. So I made a decision. If they wanted to play games, I'd play games too, but I'd play them better. First, I hired a professional surveyor to establish the exact property boundaries. No more arguing about where my land ended and community space began. I wanted official measurements that would hold up in court if necessary. While I was waiting for the survey, I started documenting everything systematically. Photos of Brent on the dock timestamps video of the trash he'd leave behind. The camera caught Brent tossing sandwich wrappers like he owned the place, and one night caught Pamela pointing at my dock while whispering into her walkie-talkie like she was leading a heist. My neighbors might think I was being petty, but I was approaching this like an engineering problem now, not an emotional reaction. That's when Mary approached me. Mary was this elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from Pamela. She'd been in the neighborhood for 20 years and pretty much knew everyone's business. One afternoon, while I'm watering my plants and probably looking pretty miserable, she walked over and said quietly, "That boy isn't her real son, you know." I looked up surprised. Mary glanced around to make sure nobody was listening, then continued, "She took him in a couple years ago when his parents died. But between you and me, I don't think she wanted a son. I think she wanted someone to use." The way she said that last word made my skin crawl. I asked her what she meant, but Mary just shook her head and said, "Just keep your eyes open, dear. This isn't the first time she's tried to expand her territory." When the survey results came back, they confirmed exactly what I already knew. The dock was 100% on my property. No question, no gray areas. But Mary's words kept echoing in my head. Someone to use. What did that mean exactly? And what did she mean about Pamela trying to expand her territory before I started wondering how many other neighbors had dealt with Pamela's schemes and how many had just given in rather than fight? The survey papers sat in my hands like a winning card, but Mary's words kept echoing in my head. Someone to use. I wondered how many other secrets were waiting to be uncovered, and whether I was really ready to find out what kind of person I was dealing with. I didn't waste any more time playing games. The next Monday morning, I called Premier Fencing and ordered a 6-foot privacy fence with a locking gate designed to completely enclose the dock area. I'm talking heavy-duty materials, concrete footings, the whole 9 yards. When the guy asked me about permits, I told him I'd handle that myself. I went down to City Hall that afternoon and filed all the necessary paperwork. Everything was completely above board and legal, which was more than I could say for Pamela's fake HOA letters. The permit approval took 3 days, and I made sure to get multiple copies because I had a feeling I was going to need them. This wasn't just about solving a problem anymore. It was about sending a message that some people can't be reasoned with, only outmaneuvered. Tuesday morning, the materials arrived in a big delivery truck that couldn't be missed. Fence posts, panels, bags of concrete hardware, everything stacked neatly in my driveway where Pamela couldn't help but see it from her kitchen window. I'd taken the day off work specifically to supervise this project, and I have to admit there was something deeply satisfying about watching those materials get unloaded. This was my line in the sand, literally. No more negotiations, no more fake legal documents, no more watching some stranger lounge around on my property like he owned it. I was solving this problem the way I should have from the beginning, with clear physical boundaries. Each piece of lumber felt like a small victory, a tangible step toward reclaiming what was mine in the first place. She marched over holding the clipboard like a sheriff's badge, only to freeze when I calmly held up the city permit like a mirror to her power trip. I was standing there with my coffee, probably looking calmer than I felt, and I just said, installing a fence on my property. I have permits. I held up the official city permits, all properly signed and stamped. She stared at them like they were written in a foreign language, then started ranting about community access and property rights and how I was destroying the neighborhood character. I just nodded politely and told her the construction crew would be here at 7 a.m. sharp. The look on her face when she realized her usual intimidation tactics weren't working was almost worth the price of the fence by itself. Wednesday morning, Premier Fencing showed up right on schedule. Professional crew, good equipment, and they knew exactly what they were doing. I'd positioned myself in a lawn chair where I could watch both the construction and the Sloan house because I knew this was going to trigger some kind of response. Sure enough, Brent was still camped out on the dock when the crew arrived, looking confused and increasingly uncomfortable as the workers started measuring and marking fence line locations. The crew foreman walked over to explain what was happening, and Brent actually seemed surprised, like he'd somehow convinced himself that squatters' rights were a real thing. Each thud of the post driver felt like reclaiming an inch of dignity. The scent of sawdust and wet soil filled the air like freedom in progress. About an hour into the construction, Pamela called the police. I watched her through my kitchen window, gesticulating wildly while she talked on the phone, probably claiming I was destroying community property, or building without permits, or violating some imaginary HOA regulation. 20 minutes later, 2 officers showed up and asked to see my paperwork. I handed over the permits, the property survey, and my deed, and they spent about 5 minutes reviewing everything. One of them walked the property line with me, confirmed that everything matched the official survey, then told Pamela that this was a civil matter and that all my construction was completely legal. The look on her face when the cops basically told her to mind her own business, priceless. From across the street, old Mrs. Miller watched through her blinds, coffee in hand. She didn't wave, but she didn't look away either. By noon, the fence was really taking shape, and you could see how it was going to completely enclose the dock area. That's when Pamela completely lost it. She came marching over, not with her usual clipboard and official demeanor, but looking genuinely panicked. "You can't do this! Brent needs this space," she screamed at me, and for the first time since this whole thing started, I heard something in her voice that sounded almost desperate. Like this wasn't just about property rights or community access, but something deeper. I looked at her, really looked at her, and asked, Why does he need my dock so badly? There's plenty of other waterfront in this neighborhood." She just stared at me for a second, then turned around and stormed back to her house without answering. The desperation in her voice made me wonder what exactly she was so afraid of losing. That's when Greg finally stepped in. I'd been wondering where he was during all this drama, and honestly I was starting to think he was just as crazy as his wife. But around 2 o'clock, while the fence crew was installing the gate hardware, Greg walked over to where I was standing. He looked tired, older than I'd thought, and when he spoke his voice was quiet and serious. "I'm sorry, Darren. This has gone too far." He stood there watching the workers for a minute, then said something that made my blood run cold. She didn't adopt Brent out of kindness. She needed someone to project onto, someone she could control completely, and when that wasn't enough, he looked at the dock. She needed to expand that control. The way he said it made me realize this wasn't just about my dock. It was about a pattern of behavior that had probably been going on for years. Greg continued talking, and what he told me painted a picture of Pamela that was even more disturbing than I'd imagined. According to him, she'd been planning this dock takeover from the day they moved in. She had specifically chosen their house because she could see my dock from her backyard, and she'd immediately started plotting ways to gain access to it. Brent wasn't just her adopted son. He was her tool, her way of staking claims and testing boundaries. And this wasn't the first time. Apparently, she'd tried similar schemes with their previous neighbors, always finding ways to gradually expand her territory and control. "I've been collecting evidence," Greg said quietly, "for divorce proceedings. But when I saw what she was doing to you, and to Brent, I realized this was bigger than just our marriage." The picture he painted was of someone who saw the entire neighborhood as a chessboard, with everyone else as pieces to be moved around for her benefit. By evening, the fence was finished. 6 feet of solid privacy fencing completely surrounding my dock, with a heavy-duty lock on the gate that only I had keys to. The workers had done an incredible job. Clean lines, professional installation, everything exactly to code. I walked around the perimeter once checking their work, and I have to admit it felt good. Really good. This was my space again, protected and private, exactly the way it should have been from the beginning. But the best part was watching Pamela stand outside that fence staring at the dock she could no longer access. For the first time since I'd met her, she was completely, utterly silent. The fence stood between us like a physical manifestation of the boundary she'd tried so hard to erase. He gathered his things slowly, almost ritualistically, like someone waking from a dream they didn't know they had been in. I'd expected him to put up a fight, or at least complain, but he just folded his chair, packed his cooler, and gathered his little table, moving like someone who was finally understanding the situation for the first time. Maybe he'd finally realized that this whole situation was insane, or maybe he was just tired of being his adoptive mother's pawn. Either way, watching him leave felt like the end of something. The fence stood there between us and them, solid and permanent, and I couldn't help but think about Greg's words about patterns and control. Watching Pamela stand motionless by that fence, I thought I'd feel victorious. Instead, I just wondered, was this really the end? The fence had been up for exactly 1 week when everything started falling apart for Pamela. My lawyer had filed a formal complaint with the regional HOA oversight board, complete with copies of her forged letters, the fake meeting minutes, and documentation of her harassment campaign against me. These regional oversight folks don't mess around. They've seen every HOA scam in the book, and Pamela's amateur hour approach to fraud was like waving a red flag in front of them. They called for an emergency review and temporarily suspended her as HOA president pending a full investigation. The irony wasn't lost on me that she got taken down by the same emergency procedures she'd tried to use against me. Sometimes justice has a sense of humor, even when you're too angry to appreciate it in the moment. But the real bombshell came when Greg asked to meet with me privately. He showed up at my door on a Thursday evening, carrying a cardboard box that looked like it weighed 20 pounds. "I need to show you something I should have shown months ago," he said, and his voice had this tone like he was confessing to a crime. We sat at my kitchen table, and he placed the box on my table like it weighed more than paper, like it carried years of watching and saying nothing. "This is overdue," he muttered. He started pulling out documents that painted a picture of Pamela that was even worse than I'd imagined. Email printouts where she'd discussed her plan to gradually establish community precedent regarding my dock. Bank statements showing her misusing HOA funds for personal landscaping projects. And most disturbing of all these typed-up notes, documenting her emotional manipulation tactics with Brent, like a manual for psychological control. Greg spread it all out on my table like evidence in a criminal case, which honestly, it probably was. "I've been documenting everything for divorce proceedings," he explained. "But when I saw what she was doing to you, and especially what she was doing to Brent, I realized this was bigger than just ending my marriage." He showed me recordings he'd made of Pamela on the phone, planning other community improvements around the neighborhood. Apparently, my dock was just the first target in a larger scheme to gradually take control of various neighbor properties. She had her eye on the Johnsons' gazebo next, and she was planning to claim that Mrs. Miller's garden shed was blocking a community sight line to the water. One printout stopped me cold, a spreadsheet labeled behavioral compliance risk, with my name rated as a level 4 obstruction. Level 5 was blacked out. The systematic nature of it was what really got to me. This wasn't random craziness, it was calculated manipulation. The thing that really got to me was reading her notes about Brent. She wrote about him like he was a chess piece instead of a person. Subject responds well to praise-based manipulation, and increasing dependency ensures compliance with property expansion projects. I mean, what kind of person thinks about their own adopted son that way? Greg saw me reading those pages and said quietly, "She didn't take him in because she wanted to help. She wanted someone she could completely control, someone with no other family who'd be dependent on her for everything." It was sick, really genuinely sick. When I asked Greg why he was coming forward now, his answer was simple. Brent deserves better than being someone's puppet, and you deserve to enjoy your property in peace. He'd been gathering evidence for months, originally planning to wait until his divorce was finalized before exposing Pamela's other schemes. But watching her harassment campaign against me and seeing how she was manipulating Brent into being part of it had convinced him that waiting wasn't an option. The regional HOA board moved fast once they saw Greg's evidence. They called Pamela in for a hearing the following Tuesday, and based on the documentation, they immediately removed her as HOA president and launched a formal investigation into financial misconduct. They also required her to make full reimbursement to me for my legal fees and fence costs. Apparently, when you use forged documents to harass your neighbors, there are actual consequences. Who knew? But the strangest thing was Pamela's reaction to all this. Complete silence. No angry phone calls, no screaming confrontations in the driveway, no clipboard-wielding marches around the neighborhood. For the first time since this whole thing started, my phone didn't ring with complaints. It was almost eerie, like the calm before a storm, except the storm had already happened, and this was just the aftermath. Turns out, I told Greg later, emergency powers work both ways. Greg also officially petitioned for legal guardianship of Brent, explaining that the kid was technically still dependent due to developmental issues related to childhood trauma. "He's not going back to her," Greg said firmly. "I don't care what it takes legally, but he's not going to be her tool anymore." Watching Greg step up for Brent like that made me realize that not all the Sloans were cut from the same cloth. Greg had been trapped in this situation just like the rest of us, but unlike me, he couldn't just build a fence to solve his problems. He'd had to live with the source of the chaos, watch it destroy relationships and manipulate a vulnerable young man, all while gathering evidence for the day he could finally do something about it. I had to respect the patience and strategic thinking that took, even if I couldn't imagine living that way myself. The really surprising thing was how the neighbors started reacting once word got around about what had really been happening. Mrs. Miller came over with a plate of homemade cookies and an apology note. Even the Johnsons, who once praised Brent for making the lake feel alive, knocked on my door. "We didn't know," they said. "We were scared to push back." Even people I barely knew started approaching me with their own Pamela stories. Turns out half the neighborhood had been dealing with her schemes in one form or another, but everyone had been afraid to speak up. It was like watching dominoes fall in reverse. Instead of everything collapsing, people were finally standing up straight and admitting what they'd been dealing with all along. The community healing felt organic, like everyone had been holding their breath for months and could finally exhale. 2 weeks later, Pamela quietly put her house on the market. No goodbye, no explanation, no final confrontation. She just left. The for sale sign went up on a Monday, and by the end of the week, there were already people coming to look at the property. I watched from my kitchen window as the real estate agent showed potential buyers around, and I couldn't help but wonder what they'd think if they knew the full story of what had happened here. Can you believe sometimes justice comes from people you'd never expect? Pamela disappeared like she'd never existed, but looking at Greg and Brent, I wondered, was this really the end or just the beginning of something better? The neighborhood felt different now, like we'd all learned something important about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. 2 months after Pamela's disappearance, I was finally getting to enjoy my morning coffee on my dock again. Behind the fence that now had climbing roses growing up the sides, courtesy of Mrs. Miller's gardening advice. It's funny how much more peaceful everything felt once that constant tension was gone. I didn't realize how much stress I'd been carrying until it was over. Every morning, I'd unlock that gate walk out to my bench and just sit there, listening to the water lap against the dock posts. No angry phone calls, no clipboard-wielding neighbor demanding explanations, no unemployed 20-something treating my property like his personal resort. Just peace. The dock creaked under me like an old friend clearing its throat. The sound used to blend into the background, now I noticed it. Now I appreciated it. The biggest change was watching what happened to Brent once he was living with Greg full-time. I'd see them working in the yard together, and the kid looked different. More focused, less lost, like he'd found some kind of purpose. Greg enrolled him in community college part-time, and Brent, once a ghost on my dock, now stood behind the counter at the hardware store, greeting me by name, asking about fasteners with genuine interest. Nothing glamorous, but he seemed to take pride in it. I'd run into him occasionally at the store when I was buying supplies for house projects, and he'd actually make eye contact now, instead of staring at the floor. Last week, he even waved at me from across the parking lot, instead of pretending he didn't see me. It was like watching someone discover who they really were when they weren't being manipulated into being someone else. Greg stopped by one evening in late September to give me an update on how things were going. We sat on my back porch, and he looked more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. "Wanted to thank you again," he said, "and to let you know the divorce was finalized last month. Pamela moved 3 states away, bought a house in some retirement community where she can be the queen bee of a bunch of people who don't know her history yet." He paused and took a sip of his beer. "I feel sorry for her new neighbors, honestly." We both laughed at that, but it was kind of true. Somewhere out there, Pamela was probably already sizing up someone else's property and planning her next scheme. Some people never learn that the world doesn't belong to them, no matter how many clipboards they carry or official-sounding letters they write. The community healing process was interesting to watch. Mrs. Miller didn't just apologize with cookies. She actually helped organize a neighborhood barbecue where people could air out all the grievances that had been building up during Pamela's reign of terror. Turns out she'd been manipulating and pressuring half the street about various community improvements that were really just ways for her to expand her control. The Johnsons talked about how she'd been pressuring them to relocate their gazebo. The elderly couple at the end of the street had been getting letters about their non-compliant mailbox placement. Even the guy who lived across the lake had stories about Pamela trying to claim water access rights that didn't exist. It was like discovering that what I'd thought was a personal attack had actually been part of a much larger campaign to control and intimidate the entire neighborhood. The new HOA president, elected fairly this time through an actual transparent process, was a retired teacher who seemed to understand that the HOA's job was to maintain common areas and enforce reasonable community standards, not to redistribute private properties based on whoever complained the loudest. She actually came to my house personally to apologize for what had happened and to assure me that nothing like it would happen again. "We've implemented new procedures," she explained. "No more emergency votes, no more unilateral decisions, and definitely no more forged signatures." It was nice to know that some good had come out of this whole mess. Sometimes it takes one person's outrageous behavior to show everyone else what reasonable actually looks like. The contrast made normal neighborhood life feel like a luxury I'd forgotten I was entitled to. I kept thinking about what Mary had said months ago about Pamela wanting someone to use rather than someone to love. But watching Greg and Brent now, I realized something important. Sometimes the people being used are stronger than anyone gives them credit for. Brent wasn't just surviving without Pamela's manipulation. He was thriving. He'd figured out how to be part of a real family instead of being someone's tool, and Greg had stepped up to be the father figure the kid actually needed instead of the one Pamela had forced him to pretend to be. It was proof that people can recover from psychological manipulation when they're given the chance to remember who they really are underneath all the control and expectations. About 3 months after everything settled down, I made a decision about the fence. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't taking it down or anything crazy like that, but I hired a contractor to install a small gate facing Greg's yard. Figured good neighbors should be able to visit properly, I told him when I showed him the new addition. The look on his face was worth the extra construction cost. It wasn't about giving up my boundaries or pretending this whole thing hadn't happened. It was about recognizing the difference between people who deserve access to your space and people who try to take it by force. The fence was still there, and it was staying there, but it didn't have to be a wall between decent people. The best moment came on a Saturday afternoon when Brent knocked on the gate and asked if he could see the dock the right way this time. I opened both gates and gave him the full tour, explaining some of the engineering principles that went into the construction. The kid was actually interested and asked good questions about load distribution and water damage prevention. "You know, I'm taking some construction classes at college," he mentioned. "Maybe sometime you could show me how the foundation anchoring works." Looking at him standing there, genuinely curious about craftsmanship, instead of just looking for a place to lounge around, I realized that 3 months ago, Brent had been a trespasser, and now he was a welcome guest who understood both the property and proper boundaries. The transformation wasn't just his, it was mine too. Sitting there watching Brent ask about construction techniques, I suddenly realized that sometimes to find real family, you have to go through battles nobody wanted. Greg and Brent had found each other through this mess. My neighborhood had learned to communicate instead of just complaining, and I'd learned that sometimes the best way to protect what's yours isn't to hide it behind walls, but to make sure the right people know they're welcome to share it. The fence was still there, and it was staying there, but it didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a foundation for something better than what we'd had before. 6 months after installing that fence, I'm sitting on my dock with my morning coffee, and I can honestly say that this whole experience taught me more about human nature and property rights than any engineering textbook ever could. People ask me all the time whether it was worth it, all the stress, the legal fees, the neighborhood drama, the sleepless nights, wondering if I was overreacting or being too stubborn. Let me tell you what I learned, because I have a feeling some of you might be dealing with your own version of Pamela right now, and maybe my experience can save you some trouble. First lesson, know your rights, and I mean really know them. I'm an engineer, so I research everything down to the last detail, but you don't need my job to understand property lines, read HO, bylaws, or learn your legal rights as a homeowner. Knowledge is power, especially when someone's trying to intimidate you with fake official documents and made-up community regulations. Spend the $20 to get copies of your deed and survey. Read your HOA rules cover to cover, even the boring parts. When someone comes at you with clipboard and walkie-talkie confidence, you want to be absolutely sure of your ground before you push back. Second lesson, document everything, and I mean everything. Photos, videos, written records, timestamps, witness names. If it happened, write it down. Without documentation, any dispute becomes he said, she said, and whoever tells the most convincing story wins. With proper documentation, you have evidence, and evidence trumps emotions every time. I probably took 500 photos of Brent on my dock, saved every fake HOA letter Pamela sent, and recorded every angry phone conversation. It felt excessive at the time, but when the lawyers and the regional oversight board got involved, all that documentation made the difference between a messy neighbor dispute and a clear case of fraud and harassment. Third lesson, stay professional even when the other person is acting completely insane. This one's harder than it sounds. Trust me, when someone's screaming at you, spreading lies about you to the neighbors, and trying to steal your property with forged documents, every instinct tells you to fight back with the same energy. But I made mistakes when I got emotional and confronted Brent too aggressively, and those mistakes got used against me. When I finally approached this like an engineering problem, methodically, systematically, with data instead of emotions, that's when things started turning around. Professional behavior doesn't guarantee you'll win, but unprofessional behavior almost guarantees you'll lose. Fourth lesson, and this one surprised me, sometimes your biggest enemies aren't the people you think they are. I spent months focusing on Pamela and Brent, assuming they were working together against me. But Greg and Brent were just as trapped in her manipulation as I was being harassed by it. Greg became one of my most important allies because he had access to information and evidence I could never have gotten on my own. Brent turned out to be a decent kid who was being used by someone who was supposed to protect him. Sometimes the person causing the problem isn't the only one suffering from that problem, and sometimes the solution helps people you didn't even know needed help. The bigger picture here is that this was never really about a dock. It was about power control, And what happens when someone decides they can take what belongs to other people through manipulation and fake authority? Pamela's scheme worked on psychological principles. Get people used to seeing something, make it seem official through paperwork and procedures, isolate the target by turning the community against them, then present the final takeover as a reasonable compromise. If I'd given in, if I'd agreed to share my dock with Brent to keep the peace, it wouldn't have ended there. It would have been validation that her methods work, and she would have moved on to the next target with even more confidence. Current update on how everything turned out. My dock is still beautiful now, with better security, and those climbing roses that make the fence look intentional rather than defensive. Brent graduated his construction program with honors and got hired full-time by a local contractor with benefits and a future. Greg remarried a woman who actually appreciates having Brent as part of the family instead of treating him like a tool. The new HOA runs with complete transparency, proper procedures, and actual community input. And get this, 3 other neighbors have built their own fences after seeing how well mine worked out, not because they're antisocial, but because they learned the value of clear boundaries. You know what the best part is? Last weekend I'm sitting here with my morning coffee, and I hear voices from Greg's backyard. It's him, his new wife, and Brent planning a deck project together. They're talking about materials and measurements and proper foundation work, and Brent is contributing ideas based on what he learned in his construction classes. Real family, real respect, real boundaries. That's what it sounds like when people choose to work together instead of one person trying to control everyone else. Someone asked me recently, was it worth all that trouble just for a dock? Here's what I told them. Justice doesn't require grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it just requires the right person at the right time, refusing to back down from what's right. I didn't set out to be a neighborhood hero or to save Brent from his manipulative adoptive mother. I just wanted to drink my coffee in peace on property I'd worked hard to afford. But when you stand up for what's legitimately yours, sometimes you end up protecting more than you realized. I sometimes wonder where Pamela is now, maybe plotting her next improvement plan. But fences work both ways, keeping danger out and hard-won peace in. I'm still here every morning on my dock, earning my peace 1 cup of coffee at a time. That fence, best investment I ever made, not just for the property protection, but for the principle it represents. Every slat in that fence had become more than protection. It was a line in the sand between manipulation and mutual respect. Sometimes, when you draw clear lines and defend them properly, you don't just save yourself, you end up protecting people who didn't even know they needed it. The lake's quiet again. Coffee tastes like it used to. And that fence still standing, if someone's circling. What's yours trying to inch in and make you question it? Don't. You hold your ground. You don't owe anyone your silence. If this reminded you of something you've lived through, I'd really like to hear it. And hey, if this story meant something to you, there's a little thanks button down there. No pressure, just putting it out there.
Thanks for watching QA Stories. If you enjoyed this one, hit that like button and don't forget to subscribe for more wild tales coming your way.